For Travis Kelce, the off-season was supposed to be a chance to step away. After another exhausting NFL season, another year of enormous expectations, and another chapter of a career that has already lasted far longer than most players ever experience, there was finally a reason to put football aside for a moment. There was a wedding. There was a summer. There was family, celebration, and a chance to enjoy life away from the pressure of the football field. So when Kelce was asked what his wedding was like and how the rest of his summer had gone, his answer was surprisingly simple. He called the wedding the best night of his life. And then, almost immediately, he moved on. Football. That was the striking part. The wedding mattered. The celebration mattered. The off-season mattered. But now the pads were back on. And for a player entering his 14th NFL season, that transition says a lot about where Travis Kelce is mentally. He isn't approaching another season like someone simply trying to extend his career. He's approaching it like someone who believes there is still something unfinished. Something to prove. Something to improve. And perhaps most importantly, something to give to the teammates around him. That is what makes this interview so interesting. Because underneath the jokes, the football talk, and the casual locker room energy is a much bigger story about a veteran athlete entering a completely different phase of his career. Travis Kelce is no longer the young player trying to prove that he belongs. He's no longer the rising star trying to establish himself. He's already done that. He's already won championships. He's already become one of the most recognizable players in the NFL. He's already built a legacy. And yet, somehow, the motivation is still there. If you're following every chapter surrounding Taylor Swift, Travis Kelce, and the world that has grown around them, this is exactly the kind of moment worth slowing down for. Because the most revealing stories aren't always the loudest ones. Sometimes they come from a veteran player answering a few simple questions at training camp. And sometimes, one sentence tells you more about the next chapter than an entire headline ever could. Welcome back to Taylor Timeline. Here, we follow the moments surrounding Taylor's world with the context, emotion, and bigger picture they deserve. And this time, the spotlight turns toward Travis Kelce, not because of a celebrity headline, but because of what he said when the cameras were focused on football again. Because once the wedding celebrations were over, Travis had a very different mission. And he made that mission surprisingly clear. The question sounded easy. How was the wedding? How was the summer? For most people, that might be the perfect opportunity to tell a story. Maybe talk about the celebration. Maybe mention the people who attended. Maybe share a funny memory. But Kelce kept his answer remarkably restrained. He described the wedding as the best night of his life. He thanked everyone who came out to celebrate with them. He acknowledged that it was a crazy night, full of celebration. And then he essentially closed the subject. Football was calling. That response is important because it shows the difference between the public spectacle surrounding a celebrity life and the way Kelce himself was choosing to frame the next chapter. The wedding was meaningful. The celebration was meaningful. But training camp was where his attention now belonged. And that's a recurring theme throughout this interview. Kelce isn't talking like someone who has lost his hunger. He's talking like someone who knows exactly what his next responsibility is. For years, fans have watched athletes reach the later stages of their careers and slowly shift their priorities. The physical demands become harder. Recovery takes longer. Young players arrive every off-season. The game gets faster. And the question inevitably becomes, how much longer can this last? For Kelce, the answer appears to be tied to one simple idea. He still loves football. Not just the fame surrounding it. Not just the championships. Not just the spotlight. The game itself. And that distinction matters. Because when Kelce was asked why he still wanted to play after already accomplishing so much, he didn't point to money or attention. He talked about love for the game. He talked about believing he can still perform at a high level. And he talked about wanting to prove that he can play better than he did the previous year. That last part may be the most revealing. Because a player who has already accomplished as much as Kelce could easily look backward. He could talk about what he's already done. He could point to his records. He could point to championships. He could talk about his place in NFL history. Instead, he's looking forward. He's evaluating himself based on what comes next. And that tells you exactly what kind of veteran he believes he needs to be. There was a time when Travis Kelce's biggest goal was simply making the team. He said that himself. When he was asked how his motivation had changed from year 1 to year 14, his answer was almost amusingly straightforward. Year 1. He was just trying to make the team. 14 years later, the objective is completely different. Now he's trying to figure out how to bring other players along with him. That's a massive transition. Young Travis Kelce was fighting for his own opportunity. Veteran Travis Kelce is thinking about the opportunities of everyone around him. That's what happens when a player becomes part of a team's culture rather than simply a participant in it. He talked about enjoying the moments with the players he has helped build that culture with. He mentioned Andy Reid. He mentioned Patrick Mahomes. He mentioned Chris Jones. And he talked about the broader group of players who have become part of the identity of the team. This isn't simply about football ability anymore. It's about responsibility. When you're one of the most experienced players in the locker room, younger teammates are watching you. They watch how you prepare. They watch how you respond after mistakes. They watch how you handle adversity. They watch whether the veteran who has already won everything still works as hard as everyone else. And Kelce understands that. That's why his answer about accountability becomes so important. He said he wants to be accountable for the guys in the room and for every play he's out there. That is a very different mentality from simply asking, how many catches am I going to get? How many touchdowns am I going to score? How many yards am I going to have? Those numbers still matter. But at this stage, Kelce appears to be thinking about something larger. What kind of teammate will he be? What kind of leader will he be? And when things go wrong, will his teammates want him beside them? That last question might be the most powerful idea in the entire interview. Because football doesn't only test players when everything is going right. It tests them when the game becomes chaotic. When the offense stalls. When the defense gives up a big play. When the team falls behind. When injuries appear. When expectations become pressure. That's where leadership becomes real. And Kelce says he wants to be one of the players everyone can count on when the team is in that metaphorical foxhole. That isn't the language of someone simply trying to survive year 14. It's the language of someone trying to define what year 14 means. There is another important part of Kelce's comments. He doesn't pretend the previous season was perfect. In fact, he openly acknowledges areas where he believes he needs to improve. He talked about being more accountable when the ball is in the air. He mentioned games from the previous year where he felt he had put too much responsibility on himself. He talked about blocking. He talked about helping spring teammates for bigger gains. And he talked about leadership. That combination is revealing. Because the easy story would be to say that Travis Kelce is a veteran who has already accomplished everything. The more interesting story is that he doesn't appear satisfied with that description. He's looking at the previous season and asking what he could have done better. That's a completely different mindset. At this stage of a career, self-criticism can actually become more important than outside criticism. A younger player may need coaches to tell him where he needs to improve. A veteran knows. He has enough experience to recognize the moments that got away from him. He knows when he could have blocked better. He knows when he could have made a different play. He knows when he could have communicated better. And Kelce appears to be carrying those lessons into camp. That's why his comments about accountability aren't just generic leadership talk. They connect directly to the way he described his own performance. He wants to hold himself responsible first. Then he wants to help the players around him. And that is exactly how veteran leadership is supposed to work. Not by pretending mistakes don't happen, but by showing younger players what you do after they happen. Another moment in the interview reveals how quickly Kelce has moved past the disappointment of the previous season. The team didn't make the playoffs. That's not the standard Kansas City has established. And Kelce acknowledged the disappointment. But he also said he moved on pretty quickly. That sentence could easily be overlooked. It shouldn't be. Because for a team that has experienced so much postseason success, missing the playoffs can become emotionally dangerous. You can spend months thinking about what went wrong. You can replay individual games. You can blame injuries. You can blame execution. You can blame circumstances. Or you can use the disappointment as fuel and move forward. Kelce's comments suggest he chose the second option. Once off-season work began again, the mentality changed. Now, as training camp ramps up, the energy is different. The standard is higher. The intensity is higher. And the veterans are expected to set the tone. That's where Kelce's role becomes even more important. He isn't simply trying to get himself ready. He's helping establish what the team should look like. And when the leaders are fully engaged, younger players notice. That's why Kelce repeatedly returned to the importance of having the team's leaders out there. He specifically talked about Patrick Mahomes. And that brings us to one of the most entertaining parts of the interview. Because if you've watched Patrick Mahomes play football, you already know that the quarterback can make extraordinary plays. But Kelce wasn't talking about one of those plays. He was talking about something much simpler. Mahomes' cadence. One of the funniest details Kelce shared was his description of Patrick Mahomes' cadence. According to Kelce, there is something about the frequency of Mahomes' voice when he calls for the snap. When Mahomes says, "hut," Kelce says it can actually make players jump. Think about that. These are professional athletes. They're experienced. They're standing in practice. They're supposed to know exactly what's happening. And yet Mahomes' voice can still trigger that reaction. Kelce described it as a good cadence. It's a small detail, but it's the kind of detail that makes football culture feel real. Because fans see the games. They see the touchdowns. They see the celebrations. They see the quarterback throwing the ball. They see Kelce catching it. But they don't always see the tiny habits that exist inside a professional locker room. The sounds, the timing, the routines, the little things teammates become familiar with over years of playing together. And Kelce clearly has an enormous amount of respect for Mahomes. He called him a brother. He expressed pride in how Mahomes handled adversity after the previous season. And he emphasized that Mahomes appeared to be enjoying the game again. That last point matters. Football can become incredibly serious at this level. 4 stars, every mistake becomes a headline. Every injury becomes a storyline. Every loss becomes a debate. So seeing a leader competing, enjoying himself, and setting the tone can change the mood of an entire team. Kelce clearly believes that matters. Because leadership isn't only about giving speeches. Sometimes leadership is simply showing up with the right energy. The relationship between Kelce and Mahomes has become one of the defining partnerships of the modern Kansas City era. And Kelce's comments show that the relationship is about more than statistics. He focused heavily on accountability. Mahomes, according to Kelce, has become increasingly willing to hold teammates accountable directly. That's difficult, especially during the exhausting portion of training camp. When players are tired, when bodies hurt, when repetition starts to become mentally draining. That's when even constructive criticism can feel personal. But Kelce says Mahomes has become very good at challenging teammates without turning them against him. That's an underrated skill. There are players who lead through their performance. There are players who lead through their voice. The most effective leaders often learn how to do both. Kelce believes Mahomes has developed that ability. And perhaps more importantly, Kelce recognizes it because he has been part of that evolution himself. For years, these players have been learning how to operate at the highest level together. They've experienced wins. They've experienced setbacks. They've dealt with enormous expectations. And now they're entering another season where the margin for error is smaller than ever. That is why Kelce's comments about the team's leaders setting the standard are so significant. The younger players aren't just learning plays. They're learning habits. They're learning expectations. They're learning what Kansas City considers acceptable. And the veterans understand that every rep becomes an example. There is something almost contradictory about Travis Kelce's current position. On one hand, he is one of the most decorated players in the league. On the other hand, he is still talking like he has something to prove. That's the tension at the center of his Year 14 story. He's not chasing the same things he chased when he was a rookie. But he hasn't stopped chasing things. His goals have simply evolved. At 14 years into an NFL career, Staying healthy is an achievement. Remaining productive is an achievement. Continuing to earn the trust of teammates is an achievement. And being able to walk into training camp still believing you can improve? That's an achievement of its own. Kelce specifically said he believes he can play at a high level. But he didn't stop there. He wants to play at a better level than he did last year. That's a challenge directed at himself. And perhaps that's why his comments about motivation feel different. He isn't trying to convince the world that he still belongs. He's trying to convince himself that he can still reach the standard he has set. Those are very different battles. And this brings us back to that very first question. How was the wedding? Kelce's answer was brief. The best night of his life. Then football. At first, that might sound like a throwaway moment. But in the context of everything else he said, it becomes much more meaningful. The off-season represented a major personal chapter. But the return to football represents another chapter entirely. And this is where the broader interest surrounding Kelce and Taylor Swift inevitably enters the conversation. Not because this particular interview gives us details about Taylor that aren't there, but because Kelce's public life now exists at the intersection of professional football, celebrity culture, relationships, and intense public attention. That makes every transition in his life more visible. But the important thing about this interview is that Kelce himself kept bringing the conversation back to football. His focus was on the team, on improvement, on leadership, on accountability, on his relationship with teammates, on Patrick Mahomes, on the standard. That distinction matters, because celebrity attention can make a football player famous beyond the field. But once the pads go on, the game still demands the same things from everyone. Blocking, catching, running, reading defenses, communicating, recovering, and leading. No amount of fame can make those responsibilities disappear. And Kelce knows that. One of the biggest themes in Kelce's interview is his desire to bring younger players with him. That might be one of the clearest signs that his role is changing. The rookie version of Travis Kelce needed veterans. The veteran version of Travis Kelce is becoming one. That's a full-circle moment. Imagine the difference between walking into the NFL wondering whether you'll make the roster and walking into training camp 14 years later knowing that younger players are studying you. They are watching your preparation. They're watching how you communicate. They're watching how you react after a bad play. They're watching how seriously you take practice. And they're watching whether you still work when nobody needs to convince you to. Kelce understands that. That's why he isn't simply measuring his season in personal production. He's thinking about culture. And culture is difficult to quantify. You can't put leadership on a stat sheet. You can't calculate accountability with a box score. But inside an NFL locker room, those things can determine how a team behaves when the pressure becomes overwhelming. Kelce wants to be the player everyone trusts when things get difficult. That's a powerful role. And it's probably one of the most important roles he can play at this point in his career. The interview also moves beyond Kelce and into the broader Chiefs training camp picture. Head coach Andy Reid talked about the importance of live action for evaluating young players. The repetition of practice can only tell coaches so much. Eventually, players have to tackle. They have to block. They have to make decisions at full speed. They have to deal with the chaos of an actual game environment. That's why the preseason becomes so important for players fighting for opportunities. And Kelce understands that better than almost anyone. He's been through the process. He's watched players arrive with enormous potential and discovered just how difficult the NFL can be. He's watched rookies adjust. He's watched veterans establish themselves. He's watched teammates fight for roster spots. And now he's part of the veteran group responsible for helping create the environment those players enter. That's another reason his comments about leadership matter. A young player doesn't just need talent. He needs to understand the standard. And veterans like Kelce are part of teaching that standard. Andy Reid's comments in the source provide another layer to the story. The coaching staff isn't simply looking for spectacular plays. They're evaluating fundamentals. Blocking, tackling, returns, ball security, decision-making, consistency. For some players, one impressive moment might get attention. But a full season requires much more than that. And that philosophy mirrors what Kelce said about his own game. He isn't talking only about highlight reel plays. He's talking about blocking better, being more accountable, helping teammates, leading. Those are the details that become more important as a player ages. Because experience isn't just about knowing how to make a great play. It's about knowing how to make the right play repeatedly. That's what coaches trust. That's what teammates trust. And that's what Kelce is trying to demonstrate again. There is a common assumption that training camp is primarily about young players proving themselves. But veterans are being evaluated too. Sometimes by coaches. Sometimes by teammates. And often by themselves. For Kelce, this may be one of the most important evaluations of his career. Not because anyone needs to know whether he can play football. They already know. The question is whether he can continue to operate at the level he expects from himself. Can he stay healthy? Can he remain explosive? Can he block effectively? Can he make the difficult catches? Can he maintain the mental discipline required of a veteran? Can he lead when the team is struggling? And perhaps the biggest question, can he still be the Travis Kelce that Kansas City has depended on for so many years? Kelce's answer appears to be yes. But he's not asking fans to take his word for it. He wants to prove it on the field. Year 14 isn't simply another number. For an NFL player, it represents an enormous amount of time. Think about how much changes in 14 years. Players come and go. Coaches change. Offenses evolve. Defenses evolve. Rules change. Training methods change. Young stars become veterans. Veterans retire. And somehow, Kelce is still standing there. Still practicing. Still competing. Still talking about getting better. That is the extraordinary part. At this point, his career is no longer simply about how many seasons he can accumulate. It's about what he does with them. If the younger Kelce was chasing a place in the NFL, the older Kelce is chasing something more complicated. Legacy, leadership, consistency, and one final opportunity to show that he can still perform at the highest level. That's why his statement about wanting to play better than last year deserves attention. It would have been easy to say, "I've accomplished enough." Instead, he effectively said, "I can be better." That mindset explains a lot about why he has lasted this long. At some point in every veteran athlete's career, the biggest battle becomes mental. The body changes. That's unavoidable. But so does perspective. A player has to decide what still matters. What is worth the sacrifice? What is worth the pain? What is worth spending another season away from normal life? Kelce has already experienced the highest levels of success. He's already played in championship games. He's already won. He's already experienced the kind of career most athletes dream about. So why keep going? His answer is surprisingly simple. He still loves the game. He believes he can still play at a high level. And he wants to help the people around him. That combination is powerful. Because love keeps you invested. Competition keeps you hungry. And responsibility keeps you accountable. Together, those three things can keep a veteran player motivated long after the novelty of professional football has disappeared. Perhaps the most revealing part of Kelce's interview is his description of the kind of teammate he wants to be when adversity hits. He wants to be the guy people want beside them. The guy teammates trust. The guy who doesn't disappear when things get difficult. That's bigger than football statistics. It's about reputation inside the locker room. And for someone who has spent 14 years building that reputation, it may be the most meaningful measure of all. Because when careers eventually end, the numbers remain. The championships remain. The records remain. But teammates remember something else. They remember who showed up, who worked, who encouraged them, who held them accountable, who stayed positive, who stayed committed, who stood beside them when everything was going wrong. Kelce appears to understand that. And that may be the legacy he's trying to build now. If you only look at Travis Kelce's upcoming season through statistics, you could miss the bigger story. The more interesting question isn't simply, how many yards will he have? How many touchdowns? How many receptions? The deeper question is, What kind of veteran will he be? Will he become an even stronger leader? Will he help younger players develop? Will he respond to the disappointment of missing the playoffs? Will he prove that last season was not the final version of what he can do? And can he help Kansas City return to the standard the organization has established? Those questions make this season much more interesting. Because Kelce isn't approaching it like a farewell tour. At least based on these comments, he's approaching it like another challenge. And that's why his training camp comments feel less like a retirement countdown and more like a declaration. He's still here. He's still hungry. And he still believes he can get better. For Taylor Swift fans, there is an important distinction to make. This particular source does not contain a detailed Taylor Swift discussion. There are no Taylor quotes in the interview. There is no confirmed statement from Taylor about the season. And there is no basis in this source for inventing what she may have thought about the wedding, training camp, or Kelce's football goals. So we shouldn't manufacture that part of the story. But Taylor's connection to Kelce is part of the broader public context that makes his life so closely followed. That means moments like this naturally attract attention beyond the NFL audience. And for fans who have watched their relationship become part of a much larger cultural story, seeing Kelce step back into football mode offers a glimpse at another side of his life. The celebrity headlines may be enormous. The cameras may be everywhere. But football still has its own rules. And once training camp begins, performance becomes the ultimate answer. That's exactly where Kelce wants the conversation to go. Back to the field. Back to the team. Back to the game. The off-season chapter is finished. The celebration is finished. The memories remain. But the next test has begun. Travis Kelce is entering another season with a target on his back, a massive amount of experience behind him, and an expectation that he can still contribute at the highest level. And this time, he isn't only responsible for himself. He's responsible for helping establish the standard for everyone around him. That's what makes his comments about accountability so important. He isn't asking for special treatment because he's a veteran. He's asking more from himself because he's a veteran. That's a subtle difference. And it may be exactly what Kansas City needs. Because championship teams aren't built only on superstar talent. When you look at Travis Kelce's career from a distance, it's easy to see the accomplishments. The championships. The records. The recognition. The enormous celebrity that followed. But listen closely to the way he talks about football now, and another story emerges. It's the story of someone who still cares. Someone who still believes he can improve. Someone who doesn't want to simply be the veteran who has already done enough. He wants to be useful. He wants to be accountable. He wants to lead. And when his teammates find themselves in difficult moments, he wants them to look around and know he's still there. That's a very different kind of ambition. The wedding may have marked one of the most meaningful personal moments of his life. But football is where his next test will take place. And for Taylor Swift fans who have followed this entire chapter, the broader story is another reminder that the people surrounding Taylor's world continue to evolve in their own ways. But we don't have to invent what happens behind closed doors. We don't need fake quotes. We don't need rumors presented as facts. Sometimes the most compelling story is simply listening to what someone actually said and understanding what it reveals. Travis Kelce said the wedding was the best night of his life. Then he went back to work. He said he still loves football. He said he believes he can play at a high level. He said he wants to be better than he was last year. And he said he wants to be someone his teammates can count on. Now comes the part no interview can predict. The part where the lights come on. The ball is snapped. The season begins. And Travis Kelce gets the chance to answer every question the only way an NFL player ultimately can. On the field. So as this next chapter begins, one thing is clear. The story of Travis Kelce's career isn't finished yet. And whatever comes next, Taylor Timeline will be here to follow the moments, the people, and the stories surrounding Taylor's world, one chapter at a time. If you're a Swiftie who loves following the bigger story behind the headlines, make sure you're subscribed to Taylor Timeline. Because sometimes the most interesting part of an era isn't the moment everyone talks about. It's what happens after the celebration ends. And for Travis Kelce, the celebration is over. Now the real test begins.